Welcome. I have a bunch of my favorite jokes and stories, and I try to kind of relegate my use of them. So I try to only use them once a year or once every 2 years. But this is one of my favorites. So maybe one that you're aware of. This fellow goes into a store and he goes up to a teenager who's stocking shelves and he's asked this question. He says, "I'm looking to buy a half head of lettuce. Do you have any?" And the teenager replies, "Well, not that I know of. Let me go check in the back." So he goes into the back. He finds his manager and he says, "Can you believe there's some moron out there trying to buy a half head of lettuce?" Well, the boss's eyes go wide and the teen turns and the guy is standing right behind him. So without even missing a beat, he says, "And this gentleman is looking to buy the other half." So after the guy leaves, the manager calls the kid into his office and says, I really like how quick on your feet you were out there. Where are you from?" And the kid says, "Well, I'm from Canada." And the manager says, "Oh, wonderful people, those Canadians." And the kid says, they're just pretty much just a bunch of hockey players and hookers." The manager's eyes narrow and he says, "My wife is Canadian." And the teenager says, without missing a beat, "No kidding. What team does she play for?" Clever boy. And this story, sometimes the opening story actually does lead into what I'm going to talk about. This one actually is about talking about truth. In the language of the Buddha, satya, in Sanskrit referred to as satya. And this is, again, part of this exploration of the 10 perfections. And I'd like to just do a quick review of these qualities. And again, the 10 perfections can be a real setup for self-rejection and self-judgment. But another way to see them is they're qualities that you can sort of reflect on and polish internally. The first is generosity. Your capacity to give of yourself, to really open to our sense of interdependence. The second quality has to do with virtue or morality. It's about knowing what you want and aligning your actions to help you move toward what is most important in your life. The third is renunciation, which is a way of looking at renunciation is this capacity to know what you want and then to begin to let go of anything that takes you away from that. The result of that quite often leads us to the next, which is cultivating wisdom, cultivating insight, seeing more clearly into the nature of reality. This kind of flows into this fifth quality, which has to do with energy, diligence, vigor, vitality. It's about aligning your energy so that you can do this work of what you are called to in your life. Quite often it's described as swimming upstream. This is the firepower to keep you engaged in your life in a way that feels wholesome. Now, while we're engaging energy and diligence and so forth at the same time, this sixth quality is kind of the balance of that, which is a quality of patience, a quality of acceptance with what you discover. And it actually is too is a quality of endurance to stay on your path. And that leads us to our exploration now, which is on truthfulness and honesty. This, of course, is kind of the pursuit of anyone in their journey. So what I'd like to talk about, again, in 4 parts, as I usually do. The first is the practice of looking for what is true. The second part, recognizing what is true. The third is in your journey, attuning to what is true. And fourth is about the application, which is the challenge of speaking to what is true. I ran across this story a while ago. This is a guy, his name is Thomas Thwaites. In 2008, very curious guy. He decided to build a toaster from scratch. He wanted to make all the materials himself. So he bought the cheapest toaster he could find, and thinking that like the cheapest, most simple toaster would be the easiest to replicate. But when he took it apart, he discovered there are 400 parts with over 100 different materials that go into a toaster. So he decided to focus on the materials he needed as just 5. That's steel, mica, plastic, copper, and nickel. He did all the smelting himself. He traveled all around the world to kind of get access to these materials. It took him 9 months to put together this toaster from scratch. Now, when he plugged it in, he wasn't able to kind of create the insulation for the wire, so it started melting in about 5 seconds. But nonetheless, what an interesting thing to take on this idea of deconstructing a toaster and building it all from scratch. What I like about that story is it's so metaphorical for the spiritual journey. Here you are trying to figure out what this worldly life is all about, and you're doing it yourself. Chances are you've tried on all kinds of different practices and traditions and philosophies and techniques to figure out what you know to be true. When you think about, just for a moment, all the different techniques that you've tried, maybe the different kinds of meditations, the books that you've read, the things that you've tried on in life, this is all part of the spiritual journey. As the Buddha said, finding your path is your path. Finding your dharma is your dharma. And sometimes, I know for myself, there have been times I've been really frustrated, like I just want to find my path. Well, I have been finding my path. I don't know about you, but I think for many people, you try something on, you think this is it. Yoga, oh, this is it. Drugs, this is it. Sex, this is it. Rock and roll, better sex. This spiritual tradition is better. This diet is better. This meditation, this is it. It's about concentration. No, it's about surrender. On and on and on, we're experimenting and experimenting and experimenting. And I think it's so important to honor this journey of exploration, because ultimately finding your path is your responsibility. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's part of the mature aspect of this tradition, of recognizing that you are your own authority. What you're seeking is found inside. And so we have all these different doorways, different paths to union. And for some of us, maybe it's a little bit clearer because a certain path kind of aligns with your temperament. One path is devotion. Devotion and love helps you to merge with the divine directly through the heart. And what I always love is those who say this is the direct path. Devotion is the direct path. You simply fuse with what you are opening your heart to. And for some people, it is. Devotion is an incredible doorway. And some people have immediate, easy access to it. And again, devotion isn't limited to any particular tradition. We see devotional practices in Christianity, in Islam, in Judaism, in Buddhism. Another approach is through this path of service, through action. Karma yoga. It's about melting away your self-identification in the name of serving others. And again, this expression shows up in all different traditions. Lose yourself in serving others. Direct path for some. For some, it's around self-discipline. It's purification of the body and the mind and spirit. Direct path. Others, it's more intellectual. You look closely at the nature of reality. You study the nature of the self, and you kind of like blow the mind by going through the mind. Direct path for some. For me, I've done a lot of wandering and a lot of lurching. For many, many years, I lived in an ashram that was very devotional, very devotional. I worked at it, I tried being devotional. I did pranams, is when you place your head beneath your heart, and I slammed my forehead to the ground many, many times a day. And what I found was that the devotional path, while I learned a lot, I grew a lot, it wasn't the direct path for me. I found myself more drawn into meditation, into study, into direct experience, into service and karma yoga. But it's important to acknowledge that you are on a path. We are all seeking truth. It was Hegel who said we're all seeking to soothe our anxiety. But beyond that, not only are we trying to soothe our anxiety, we're trying to find out what is true here. And I think sometimes what happens is we get these glimpses. We just get these glimpses of the mystery. And so the Buddha taught quite extensively around truth, basically coming down to two forms of truth. One is conventional truth. This is kind of the consensus of what is true. And then there's ultimate truth, which is what is really true. So conventional truth says, well, the chair you're sitting on is solid. Well, as we're exploring more about subatomic particles and so forth, there's actually more space than solid in that chair. And in that same way, we can feel the truth is, I'm angry right now. But if we examine that anger, we may find that anger is actually a composite of many, many different feelings. That there's sadness, there's hurt, there's disappointment. And so this very, very cool distinction, which is a talk unto itself, is a distinction between real and true. My anger feels real, but is it true? And so life gives us this constant opportunity to explore. And you can reject all traditions to find out for yourself what is true. You can stay within a tradition and dig really, really deep. You can tune into those who have walked the path before and get a sense of what they're saying, if that's really true. But the truth I think we're looking for is the sense of perennial truth. The truth that was true thousands of years ago, and the truth that is true thousands of years from now, which guides us toward an exploration of the nature of reality itself, which is where this tradition points. What is the nature of reality? What is true that is always present truth? So one thing that occurs where we tend to get stuck is when we believe something is true that is actually subject to change. When we believe that right now I feel happy and I want this truth of happiness to stay forever. What we find, of course, is that it's going to change. The 4 words that can make a happy person sad and a sad person happy, this too shall pass. And so we begin to see that, wow, there's a truth behind everything that changes. What could that be? And here's where we get to tap into those who've walked before us. And again, as I've said ad nauseum perhaps, when the Buddha shared about these characteristics of reality, he was important to point out that you shouldn't believe them at face value. He said, don't believe a word of what I'm telling you, but explore as to whether you can validate this in your own experience. And so we have these pointers toward this sense of perennial or eternal truth. And one of them is impermanence. The recognition that all conditioned things change. Anything that is the result of causes and conditions is subject to change. Truth, or the supposition of truth. The second characteristic of reality has to do with your relationship to change. Anything that you are resisting about what's changing, to the degree you resist, you will suffer. So it's the stress and suffering that we have in relationship to what is changing. The third is a little challenging. And it points toward this concept of not self. And essentially you can see that as what is changing is deeply impersonal. And actually who you are, is also subject to impermanence. That there's an element of you that is born out of causes and conditions. Your physical form came from a mother and a father. Your beliefs and thoughts and moods, they're all subject to causes and conditions, so therefore they are subject to change. Your body will get old and die. Your beliefs are malleable. And is there something about you in the midst of all that is changing that is also changeless? So it points toward the conditioned self, but also it points toward this unconditioned self. So things change. Your relationship to what's changing determines your stress and suffering level. And you yourself are the result of causes and conditions. So the question then is is that true? This is what I love about these teachings through this lens of Buddhist psychology. Don't believe it. Since if you can find this balance where you're open, but you're skeptical. And so I remember the first time I ran across these three characteristics of reality. In Pali, they're anicca. Anicca is impermanence. Dukkha is the stress and suffering and dissatisfaction that occurs when you resist. And anatta points toward this sense of not self. And so I spent many, many hours on a retreat going is it true that everything condition changes? And so hours and hours and hours just looking at my relationship to change. Is it true that anything I'm holding on to will result in some kind of dissatisfaction? What do you know? It seemed to be true. And is it true that all of this is impermanent? And that opened a whole inquiry who is it that's observing? Where is awareness? Is awareness here in my head? Is it in my belly? Very, very powerful doorway. So I wanted to lead what I think is just a really helpful little reflection on these three characteristics. So if you like, you can close your eyes. And you might now just slow down and deepen your breath just a little bit. And for this little meditation, I'd like to invite you to turn your attention to the sounds around you. Can you open your awareness 360 degrees? And can you attune to the sounds that are the furthest away at the edge of your capacity to hear? And can you simultaneously turn your attention to the sounds that are the closest to you? I'll add one other little possibility here, and that is to notice this distinction in how you listen. One is through the mind, where your mind will automatically identify location, the source, and whether it's of danger or not. The other quality is what's referred to as bare attention, which is just the direct experience without a story. And can you sense just for the next few moments to actually attune to the vibration of the sounds without a story inside? You might notice how the sounds and the sound vibrations are changing. And can you sense this quality of attention where your mind will fixate on a sound or create a story from a sound versus a sense of non-clinging and allowing? And can you notice or sense how the sounds outside you are completely beyond your control? They are utterly impersonal. That any story you make up is simply an internal process. Notice what is changing. Notice if you can let it be. And notice if you can sense how impersonal this experience is. And can you imagine applying this inner attitude toward other sensations and even toward thoughts and emotions? This sense of deep relaxation, at the same time a quality of aliveness and alertness, and a quality of utter allowing. So you might now very gently let your breath deepen. If you like, you can let your eyes open, or you can remain with them closed. And I love sound as a meditation. Quite often I'll use sound in the beginning of a meditation to sort of remind myself of these qualities of change, my relationship to change, and the impersonality of what is changing. And this points toward this recognition of truth. Impermanence, the suffering in relationship to impermanence, and the impersonality of what's occurring. Remembering these three characteristics can be super helpful, as well as remembering the Four Noble Truths. And just very briefly, and this of course can be not only a talk, but a whole lifetime of study, and that is reflecting on first the truth that stress happens. Stress, suffering, dissatisfaction are part of life. The second noble truth that there's a cause for that suffering, that dissatisfaction, that unsteadiness. And that cause has something to do with identification with holding on. The third noble truth, you can let go. We know this because we've done it to different degrees. And the fourth, that there's a path. There are observations, practices, techniques, trainings that can help you to move toward full aliveness and freedom. So applying this in our daily life and in our practice becomes very, very powerful. What do we know to be true? And just as when you're doing concentration meditation, I'm going to be present every moment. It amplifies how you're not present. And how when you focus on, I'm going to keep my heart open, you notice how your heart's closed all the time. When you focus on truth, it is going to undoubtedly bring your attention more and more subtly into delusion, into confusion, into things you believe that aren't true, the things that you don't believe that are true. We talk so much in this practice about the circle with a line through it. Above the line is what you're aware of. Below the line is what you're not aware of, and how you can move the line. A good friend of mine, in his meditation practice, started to unearth these memories of something about his mother hitting him as a small child, really, really young, and his pain and his confusion. He ruminated about this a lot. It was just these kind of like wafty little memories, but there was something very, very painful about it, something around that he interpreted as him doing something wrong and feeling responsible and her upset. He didn't get it clear. But he checked in with his mother. I think he was maybe in his 60s. His mother was quite elderly. And he said, I'm having these memories of you just hitting me. And it was this time of year. And his mother said, you had a terrible cough and a fever. And I took you to the doctor and the doctor said I needed to keep percussing on your back to keep the mucus loosened up. And for him, it was like this weight just lifted off when he realized that this whole kind of subterranean interpretation he had around his confusion and something wrong and being responsible was actually this tremendous act of love and care from his mother, who stayed up all night trying to keep him as healthy as she could. That's what I love about this practice of coming more awake to reality, getting more and more aware of truth. Inevitably, what we encounter are all the aspects of the negative self-talk that we hold about ourselves. This fundamental belief that there's something wrong with me, that I'm unworthy, that I'm not worthy of love. And here it becomes a very, very interesting thing to explore. If you're at all familiar with the work of Byron Katie, and not to pause here too long, but it's a really wonderful way of deconstructing these beliefs that you think are true. And when you really find yourself believing something, and you ask yourself, what is the core belief? And it takes some drilling down to kind of get to like the subterranean virus. And when you identify that belief, and quite often has something to do around not being worthy or not being lovable, and then you pointedly turn toward it and you ask yourself, do I know this to be true? And quite often, the immediate response is absolutely. It's there. But if you really look at, do I know this to be true? And if you get a little crack, that maybe it isn't. But then to investigate, what is it like when you think that thought and you believe it? To really get to sense the tendrils of how deep that belief lives in your nervous system. You then have this samurai sword question to ask yourself, who am I without that belief? And then to deeply listen and pay attention. And you may find it gives you a glimpse of who you are without that thought, and can open you to a deep sense of spaciousness, sometimes incredibly disorienting. And someone said, when we're little, we are these little open hard drives without any virus protection. And in many ways, what we're doing in this practice of coming more awake is we're removing those viruses and becoming aware of the thoughts and the beliefs that simply are not true. And so where we can find ourselves caught in delusion or in non-truth is in our relationships. This is where we tend to move into self-preservation, where we tend to move into judgment, where we tend to kind of calcify. I've always loved that line that says, whenever you're in conflict with someone, walk a mile in their shoes. And it makes sense because you'll have their shoes and you'll be a mile away. But if you look at your suffering, particularly in relationships, you may see that some of it is self-created. And some of it may be kind of beyond your control. And this opens us up to a really, really powerful inquiry of attuning to what is true, really looking closely to what is true. The practice of forgiveness is kind of a direct exploration of looking at some way that in pain you have turned your heart away from another. Now, not to say that turning away from another was not incredibly skillful, but when we are caught in the lack of forgiveness, quite often we're stuck in a particular point of view. And what happens is when we can open up to another's point of view, sometimes there can be a very, very profound shift. And just to share a story, this goes way, way back to my ashram days. There was a woman in our community whose husband had an affair. And he was a teacher. He was a really, really good teacher, very charismatic teacher. He was on the road a lot. And the news of his affair came out publicly in a really, really ugly way. And as you can imagine, there was a very strong polarity, but primarily he was vilified by the community. Very, very easy just to stop there and say he was wrong and she was wronged. But was so powerful. And this really kind of blew my mind, because he shared with me later how they did therapy together. He wanted to heal what could be healed. And what came out in their therapy is they were able to move into a very, very undefended place with each other, was where he said to her, "Do you remember how much I begged you to come on the road with me? Do you remember me sharing how lonely I was?" And when she was able to hear like his deep, deep need and want for her to be with him, and all the reasons she said no, and when she got kind of the sincerity of his experience, something was able to soften. Something began to shift for her. And they were able to reestablish a sense of trust and rebuild. And I'm happy to say that was about 30 years ago, and they're still together. She was absolutely betrayed. But her better sense of understanding of his point of view, that sense of understanding led to the possibility of forgiveness. Again, there's so much to say about forgiveness, because you can absolutely forgive someone and never speak to them again. You can forgive someone and never allow that behavior to ever happen again. Premature forgiveness is a big mistake when you're not ready to move into the true vulnerability of hurt. So it's important to not rush into it. But there is something here about the capacity to role reverse, the capacity to really sense what another person is needing, another person is wanting. And when you can take the time, when you feel in conflict with someone, to really imagine what it's like for them. What are they needing? What are they wanting that's not happening? You may find that there is a possibility of softening. In these days, with so much overt racism and sexism and misogyny being outed, so much suppression of non-dominant groups, global warming, or as I like to say, global weirding. And in this era of fake news, socially, we all need to slow down and keep attuning to what is actually true. With all the revisionist history now being pushed out there through textbooks and so forth, so many people wanting to revise the truth, what we need to do is to shift from that sense of conventional truth to eternal truth. When I see a headline now on my news feed, I automatically look at the subtext. Where does this come from? How is this being pitched? So if you want the truth, you have to look for it. And if you want the truth, it's going to be challenging. I find this is an oversimplification, but I kind of find there are truth people and there are compassion people. The truth people are all about, I'm going to say what's true, and then you can deal with it on your own. I'm not here to hold your hand. Then there are the compassion people. Like, I'm going to be gentle, supportive, create a safe container, and as you get less defended and less closed down, as your heart opens, you will see the truth. Each has their shadow side. Truth people can be very unskillful and hurtful, and compassion people can be conflict avoidant. And I think perhaps there's a balance. There's a real balance in here between being truthful and being compassionate. I once took on a vow of truth. This was back in the ashram days. I chose Satya because I noticed how conflict avoidant I was, and I thought, all right, from now on, I'm telling the truth. And of course, I noticed I'm lying all the time. And maybe you notice that if someone says, does this make me look fat? What do you say? Sometimes it's easier to pretend you're happy than explain why you're not. Or you laugh at something that's really not that funny. Paying attention to truth can be very, very uncomfortable. I ran across this great line that said, the only things that tell the absolute truth are children and yoga pants. So how do we bring truth into relationship? Just a few minutes left, but I wanted to share a story with you. A really good friend of mine was a CEO, and he had to fire someone. His board said, you've got to get rid of this guy. And he understood why, but the problem was, this was a personal friend of his. He brought him on, he coached him up, he supported him. His friend had a family. He was already nervous, and part of the problem was he was in over his head in this job. He just didn't have the chops to move forward with enough aggression to make his area of this company really grow. And my friend was so ripped up. How could he fire his friend? He didn't then know the criteria for wise speech, but he got there on his own. And it kind of comes down to these questions. Is what I'm about to say true? Is what I'm about to say kind? Is what I'm about to say helpful? And is what I'm about to say timely? And finally, is what I'm about to say something the other person can hear? So when he thought about all these aspects of wise speech, well, is it true? Well, yeah, I'm firing you. Can I be kind? I thought, well, I can acknowledge the work he's done, how hard he worked. Is what I'm about to say helpful? I thought, well, I can let him know I'm here to help him get relocated. Can he hear it? Well, he's going to have to hear it. And this is what I'm about to say timely. He thought about, well, what would be the best timing? And so he agonized over this, but what he came up with was simply to say, your position isn't working out. I know you know that. I know you've worked really, really hard, have given it all you have, but it's just not a match for where we want to go. I want to help you figure out what's next. But what would be best now is you take the afternoon, take the weekend to think about your transition, and let's talk on Monday so we can talk about your transition. Can you sense the skill? I so admired his skill. And you might, and again, we're closing in here at the end, you might just take a moment to kind of close your eyes and think about a conflict you might have with someone. Something that might be difficult to speak or to share. And to ask yourself, what could you say that would be true? Can you imagine phrasing this in a way that might be kind and helpful in some way? What would be the optimal timing? So if you like, you might deepen your breath. And if you like, you might open your eyes. Reflecting on truth is incredibly powerful. Moving beyond kind of conventional truth to eternal truth. It can be incredibly challenging. And where it tends to show up is in our relationships. And that little checklist, I find, can be really, really helpful. Reflecting on what is true and reflecting on what would be helpful. This is this balance of wisdom and compassion. So we have these eternal truths. All conditioned things change. Your relationship to change is what determines the degree to which you will feel stress or suffer. That much of change is impersonal. Remembering that as you move through this life, stress, dissatisfaction, unsteadiness, and suffering are part of the human journey. And if you pause and you turn to really examine that, you will discover this second truth. That there is a cause for that stress and suffering. And the cause has something to do with holding on, with identification. To the degree you are identified and holding on, to that same degree you will feel that rope burn. The third truth points toward the cessation of suffering. It's possible to let go. That shift in opening, however that happens, through compassion, through empathy, through kindness, through a shift in identity. And whatever you're holding on to can be released. And then as you are on your path, on your journey to being more awake and more alive, to know this sense of eternal truth, that there are practices, remembrances, teachings that will help you to remember your true nature as you navigate along. One thing that feels true for me is a deep sense of gratitude to be able to share these practices and teachings with you. Thank you for the opportunity to share, to walk this path together. May you in truth have a wonderful adventure. Thank you so much for your time and attention, and I look forward to being with you again soon. Take good care.